And here we are, ladies and gentlemen, a house full of guests. All of a sudden, do we have enough bedrooms, John? Did you stock up on food and drink?
There's no room in the inn.
Okay.
Bob has to sleep out with the sheep.
Sorry, Bob. You have to be in the manger, buddy. All right. It's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio and our friend Bob Seidenschwartz. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning, gentlemen.
How are you?
And Madame, good to see you.
Yes.
Karen Adams here.
Karen Adams is with us, the super forecaster. Wow. So exciting. Now, we also have another guest in studio. Could you introduce him, please?
Sure. Abhisheck, who is that the right pronunciation?
Well,
Give me close.
It's Abhisheck, right?
I mean, it's last time we did Abhisheck because that's how my parents would pronounce it. But, depending on the region of India you come from, there's a different pronunciation for the same name.
Perfect. So whatever we say is okay.
It's fine. Yeah.
Let me ask you this. How do you prefer it?
Abhisheck is
Abhisheck
good.
is got it. All right, so we're glad to have you back. It's good to see you
And
again.
Abhisheck Chatterjee, right?
Yeah.
Wonderful. All right, so now we're here to talk about. It's been, you picked a really good week to come on Talkback this morning because it has been Dramamine special when it comes to the markets. It just all of a sudden China tanked and the whole world followed right along on their coattails, down, and then China continued down. We kind of went back up again, and the roller coaster ride is underway. So, Bob, lead us here. Which direction do you want to go here?
Well, we'll get into a little bit of China, but to give a little perspective, Chinese markets going back, say, a year from this date, have been up 100%.
Okay.
And part of that was the Chinese government making it available for the average citizen to start investing in their stock market. So we had, the Chinese were pouring tremendous amounts of money into their markets, valuations soared. So even with the recent sell-off in the market, you would still be up about in the mid-30% range in terms of positive total return, just to give a little perspective. So this sell-off has been taking place for a while.
So shall we say there's wiggle room here, basically, right?
It depends on when you got in, right?
I suppose so, yeah.
Somebody's wiggle is somebody else's crisis.
Right,
but,
exactly, yeah.
So there's a lot that's been taking place. And then, of course, China comes out and says, hey, we're going to devalue the yuan a little bit. And you've got global slowdown in terms of Europe. And the United States is doing okay. It's moving along. John,
a quick question, because I think you say something like devalue the yuan, and it probably just doesn't register in people's heads. How do they do that? What does that mean? And how does that affect everybody or infect everything?
Well, normally there are many ways of devaluing your own currency. What happens is the central bank buys a lot of government bonds and generally goes on a bond buying spree, which basically causes the value of the currency to decline, and then what happens is the idea is that it should make China more competitive internationally.
I don't suppose we would kind of call that quantitative easing, would we?
Yeah, well,
it is a form of it, right?
QE.
But in the type that China did, are they basically buying up their own debt? Is that a summation of it that's accurate or not?
John, I don't know if, technically if they're buying their own debt, they're signaling to the market that they're not going to support their currency as they had previously. And I think that's the point that I want the listening audience to take away. But the question we should be asking is, why is China doing this? There is a specific reason that China is attempting to do this. And, of course, what is that signaling to its own consumers and its own market?
Yeah, the basic idea is, and this is, as you've noted, the Chinese stock market is fairly new by world standards, right. And as you pointed out, that it's only been very recently that they have it's been open to the normal population to invest. There are still like deep networks and restrictions on how you can invest, how much information you can get. There are all kinds of reasons that normal investors may not have the information that...
We call it transparency here, which is very important in understanding what you're actually getting and what information is available to you.
Well, hold on. When you talk a little bit about transparency with a communist Chinese government, aren't those antithetical? Isn't that kind of like an oxymoron, like holy war or military intelligence? Or educational television.
And Karen, one of the things that we were going to talk about today is kind of the political climate that exists in governments and how that affects things such as transparency and markets. So, we're going to broaden this out in terms of a global conversation. But I would say, Peter, we have much greater transparency in terms of just our accounting practices here. I know when we're looking at stocks, in particular, we will buy U.S. domiciled companies that are multinationals. And the reason is we don't believe we can get the type of accurate information if we're buying strictly a Chinese company domiciled in China, because from our perspective, we don't know that we can trust the information. So transparency has several different meanings, but principally in our business, that's one of the primary meanings.
I would agree that China has a long way to go to build trust in the market, but it has already done a lot to build the market. And this is part of the sort of growing pains, I think, of China becoming not only a major power, as we've called it for a long time, but actually a great power. And we can see that this week with the effect of China on world markets. It isn't just a Russia or a Brazil with a downturn. It's really bringing everybody down. Yes, John.
Last time we were on, we had this back and forth over peak China. It was a question I was trying to get you to lock in on. You definitely evaded on it, but I want to go back to you.
Gee,
I want to ask you. I want to ask you again, especially after this week. Does this look like a touchstone, a downward kind of trend from here, or do you think China will recover from this and we'll be back on track to the markets we had before?
Well, I definitely think this is a blip on the screen. But it could be a deep, and it's hard to forecast how long it will last, partly because the Chinese haven't dealt with it as adeptly as they've dealt with some other things. They apparently started to devalue partly to let the currency float more freely because they would really like it to be included in the IMF currency basket. A decision about that will be made this fall. And, to the extent that they can keep their hands off of it while the markets are readjusting, that will increase confidence worldwide in China's commitment to the market. But the problem is, in the short term, it's creating all of this volatility. And it's also it's happened at the same time as a lot of basically predictable volatility having to do with this explosive growth in the stock market in China, partly fueled by speculation on loans and wild promises and so forth. And so there's some working out to do. But I still think China is going to be, and it already is and will remain, a major player.
Let me ask, because we're up against a break, and I wanted to ask Bob and all you folks, was this action that just occurred this week, was it predictable? Did anybody see it coming? And did anybody wave a flag and said, hey, wait? Yeah, I mean, aside from Donald Trump. So, anyway, we'll
get that back on the break.
When we come back. And we also have all three lines open. If you'd like to visit with these folks who really know their business when it comes to world economics, actually political science and economics, give us a call this morning at 721-1290. We'll be right back. The theme of all investors, I will survive. I'm taking requests from Karen here this morning. 721-1290, 1-800-568-5309. Now we're talking, the political science department at the University of Montana, but right now we're talking about economics and the stock market. We have folks in studio this morning. Bob Abhisheck is with us. We have Karen, we have John, we have Peter, and we also have Richard on the line. Richard, good morning. You're on Talkback. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I've heard of that you folks just discussed the Chinese currency, and both of you, two of you, called it the yuan. I think that's Y-U-A-N, spelled something like that. I thought the Chinese government referred to their currency as the renminbi. What's the difference between the two? And why do some people refer to it as the yuan and other people refer to it as the renminbi?
Okay, we'll keep you on the line here and you have another question, so go ahead.
That's a great question, and I don't have an answer, so I'm going to ask John to Google that. because it is referred to as a renminbi and the yuan. But in terms of any language being used in publications and discussions,
Right.
you're hearing it referred to as the yuan.
Is it the same as like being a dollar as opposed to a sawbuck or what? I mean,
I don't think it's quite that
like slangy?
slanderous in
Okay.
terms of that. But
Okay.
Karen may have some insight here.
here. Go ahead. No.
I got it.
Grab
Here
a
it
mic,
is.
grab a mic, grab a mic.
Okay, this is courtesy of NPR. They do work from time to time. Sorry, they don't get paid for it apparently.
Wow,
Except for
okay.
giant corporations. Okay, here we go. The short answer: renminbi is the official name of the currency. The yuan is the main unit of currency. So I guess it's kind of like saying, hey, we have the U.S. dollar, but if we worked more in pennies or in quarters, we would call them quarters, and the currency would be called the dollar.
Okay.
You could kind of understand.
Originally, there was an internal currency and an external currency, and that
Oh.
still has something to do with the naming. But as they're moving towards this IMF currency basket, they need to rationalize to where it's the same currency and valued in the same way inside and out. So this is part of the reason for the two names.
Okay, Richard, you had another question?
No, not right now.
All right. Well, thanks for the call. Appreciate it.
Okay. Well, that's really interesting. And so NPR got it wrong on the one time I used them for something.
And your explanation of quarters and such was just ludicrous. So I'm glad we have Karen here.
As you probably have noticed, ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of fun on this show.
And we take no quarter.
That's right.
That made sense.
And that's all the time we have today. So thanks so much for joining us. We'll have about an hour and a half of dead air now. No, just kidding. Okay, so where are we going with this? Go ahead, John.
I want to follow up on a question you asked before the break.
Right.
We'll follow through on our teases here.
All right.
You asked if anybody had predicted this.
Yes.
And there was an article out in the New York Times this morning. I'm sorry, this is out of Deal Book. A warning on China seems prescient. And it was about this guy, Kenneth Rogoff, who's a forecaster on economic things.
Yeah, Ms. Super Forecaster.
So I'll just read a couple paragraphs of this, and you guys can follow through on it.
All right.
Kenneth Rogoff has long warned of a potential financial crisis in China. Rogoff, a professor in economics at Harvard University, accurately predicted the Eurozone debt crisis and for years has been telling anyone who would listen that China posed the next big threat to the global economy. And he's starting to look right again. Quote, in economics, things take longer to happen than you think they will, and they often happen faster than you thought they could, Mr. Rogoff said on Monday from Cambridge, Massachusetts, repeating a favorite line from Rudi Dornbusch, the German economist. Mr. Rogoff, who is a chess grandmaster, I don't know why they just threw that into the article, but it's great, has made a career of studying financial crises. After the 2008 financial crisis, Mr. Rogoff co-wrote, quote, This Time is Different, end quote, a seminal book that examined 8 centuries of financial crises. Every financial crisis, he and his co-author, Carmen Reinhart, concluded, stemmed from the same simple problem, too much debt. And actually, the question I asked earlier about whether China was buying up its own debt was in foresight of talking about this issue of debt and future crises. To understand the wild machinations of the stock market in recent days in the United States and abroad, you need to look no further than China's astounding debt load and sputtering economy and its ability to infect the rest of the world. Quote, China is the classic, this time is different story, Mr. Rogoff said, rattling off all the different rationalizations for why the country convinced itself and many others that it could load up on debt but was somehow immune to the laws of economic gravity. That's good writing. He cited the government's control over the markets, the hundreds of millions of workers migrating to the cities, and the country's saving rate of about 30% of disposable income as just some of the reasons China was said to be impervious to a severe downturn. Quote, it's very vulnerable, Mr. Rogoff added. There is a lot of debt. And the story goes on. They cite other experts that said similar things in the past, including some former secretaries of the Treasury, et cetera, which kind of compounds the argument there. But I kind of wanted to jump back to our discussion on the issue of debt. Is that really what drove the market down?
So a couple of things. You mentioned why they mentioned chess. Well, you have to think several moves ahead in order to be able to play that game. And the same thing is true in economics. But Abhisheck has a comment about, first of all, the paper. That may be helpful, and then we can get into some discussion about the debt issues.
the bigger question is that we must separate explanation from prediction here. Lots of people predicted that when China slows down, it's going to be a huge problem for the world. Paul Krugman has been writing for a long time about all the problems that China has with its stock market and how and the fundamentals of the economy and so on and so forth. But his reasoning is very different for why this will happen. Now, Reinhardt and Rogoff have for a long time claimed in their argument that debt is the single most important thing. Now, the paper which they based it on, the famous Reinhardt and Rogoff paper, a grad student at UMass Amherst pointed out there are all kinds of problems with the paper. Mm-hmm. They made lots of mistakes on the Excel spreadsheet, how they tried to show it. And finally, the most important thing is we don't know whether it's debt that fuels a downturn or the downturn that increases the debt to GDP ratio and so on.
So it's kind of a chicken egg problem?
Well, yeah, it's kind of, an economist would say, is it endogenous or exogenous? Is it, we don't know. I mean, and Reinhardt and Rogoff, to be fair to Kenneth Rogoff, he's been very consistent over time. I urge our listeners to check out this controversy because a lot was written on it last year. And just Google Reinhardt and Rogoff paper problems, and you'll find a lot of back and forth on this about the question of debt and how it affects the economy.
Okay.
So with every collapse like this that happens, is he proved more right or more wrong?
Well, again, there could be other arguments for why this is happening. There are other arguments which also predicted this.
We'll come back and continue to talk. We also have Mike and Dave, and we'll have more of the talk back here, the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio in a moment. We're back on Talkback, the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio. We have folks from the Political Science Department at the University of Montana joining us this morning. And I want to at least get one more phone call in here before we have to take a break at the top of the hour. Mike, you're on with our guests. Go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my call. China might be buying their debt, but will China's buying of our debt decline as they refocus their cash to their banks and stock market? And does that mean that our interest rates have to rise to attract borrowers from around the world? I mean, the rest of the world seems to be trying to cheapen their currency to make it more attractive, and the U.S., whether they like it or not, I think is going to have to strengthen, and that means more savers and less investors in the country.
Okay, so let's see if we can get it. Thanks for the call, Mike. So go ahead.
I don't expect China to ease up on buying U.S. debt anytime soon. The United States remains their largest market, and if you look at the figures, China is as dependent on the United States for its growth as the United States is dependent on China for.
So the old saw that people are afraid that China is going to come collecting all their debt all of a sudden.
No, that they would be shooting themselves, not in the foot, in some other place.
In the head.
More important place.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, go ahead, Karen.
Also, as a technical matter, it'd be hard to sell it off all at once without, the value of it falling so fast that they lose their investment. But I do want to take issue with Abhisheck's statement that China depends on the U.S. more than on anybody else, because right now Europe is the biggest China market. And you can see in recent IMF and World Bank reports models that show that as China declines in GDP growth, that it will affect Japan and the EU far more than it will affect the U.S.
So the current market shakeup, is it affecting those countries far greater than the U.S. market?
Absolutely. Right. You see that in the European markets this week. You see it all over the Asian markets.
Which really goes when we come back. Do you have another call you need to take here, Peter?
We have less than a minute. So
okay. When we come back from the break and we had our call, I want to kind of segue into some of these comments about then what do you do as a nation to keep yourself competitive? Because we get very caught up in, the dollar strengthening and weakening. These are very fluid situations that continue to evolve and contract. So rather than focusing on that, we can come back and talk about what do you do to be competitive in an ever-changing global economy?
Okay, we're going to do that when we come back from our break. Thanks so much for joining us this morning. It's the Montana World Affairs Council on the radio, actually visiting with folks from the Political Science Department at the University of Montana, if you will, mining their wisdom and knowledge. And we really appreciate them being willing to share that with us. We have two lines open. Dave, I'm going to ask you to hang on through the top of the hour break. We will get your question right after we get out of Fox News, and we hope you'll join us as well. We have two lines open. It's 721-1290. This is Talkback, and we'll continue. Hey, we have a room chock full of guests this morning, but I promised Dave he'd be first up when we're right out of the break, so let's do that right now. Dave, thanks for your patience. You're on. Go ahead.
Yeah, good morning. About currencies, I believe China had to devalue its currency. Otherwise, its export machine would start sputtering here. That was the reason they did what they had to do. But as far as China being a poor country, how could you call China, which has $3 trillion worth of foreign money in its banks, called poor? I'll hear the answer to that.
Okay, go ahead. Karen, I don't think we were saying China is like a poor country.
No.
Not at all. I didn't hear that. So my apologies, Dave, if we said China is poor. And I think Karen was stating that China is and will continue to evolve.
Right. I would say China is a very rich country right now. It has the largest foreign exchange reserves in the world, just like you mentioned, Dave, $3.6 trillion. Recently there was a report, I think it came out from McKinsey, that talked about the high level of debt in the Chinese economy, something like $28 trillion they're estimating. But that is kind of a funny number, partly because all numbers from China are a bit funny, but also because that includes both household debt and corporate debt and government debt, all the different layers of government debt. That debt is not all going to come together at once.
I want to ask something about China, because again, I'm the everyman in the room. Okay, I'm just the lunch bucket guy. But what I hear all the time is that China is actually has China been deceptive about their economy and about hiding things and hoping. It's kind of like the M&M on the conveyor belt at the grocery store, trying to keep running to keep ahead of it.
Well, I think that you could say that about a lot of economies. I mean, QE works on similar principles. The euro, you could talk about all major world economies in that same way. It's hard to know what's going on and there's good reason for that. The officials don't want the money supply to be completely transparent, because otherwise it loses its magic, right? So, but there is more of a problem in China and other emerging markets that are not fully market economies, because the rules-based system and the checks and balances, the insurance system, all of those things are really undeveloped. And the insurance is really, really important, it seems to me. In the United States and in other market economies, the insurance industry, a corporate entity, does a lot of checking to make sure that corporations are taking risks that can be insured against. And in China, that is a completely undeveloped market. So really then, there aren't a lot of backstops in China right now. The government is the one that provides all of the backstops. And households who are saving money like crazy because they don't have health insurance and they don't have, retirement income and so forth.
There's no safety net.
Right. So there really are more unknowns in China. But because China is a very wealthy country and a very productive country, I think that it will be very resilient.
I wanted to ask you a question about the way that this crash will impact foreign policy. So I think Xi Jinping comes to the United States either next week or so, maybe next couple weeks.
Yeah, end of September.
Okay.
Right. First, there's the big military parade in Beijing
of course.
In early September. And then he comes to the U.S. for a meeting with Obama and for the big UN summit.
Right. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things on the table right now that China's deeply involved in with the United States. Right. Not only the buildup of military in the sea, but also we have this Iranian deal going on that China's deeply involved with. There's a lot of things on the table.
Right.
Will this impact those negotiations, give America more or less leverage?
Well, I think that within the next several weeks, we're going to see all of this concern about the economy take a backseat to the military parade and the interest in China and showing off all of its new stuff. I was reading on the Defense Ministry blog the other day about how 80% of the equipment that will be shown in Beijing in September has never been seen before. So they're, really showing their military buildup that they've used a lot of their economic might to build. And then at the summit with the U.S., there will be big important issues like the South China Sea. And even beyond that, China is the head of the G20 next year. China is going to play a very important role in how the whole world economy adjusts to the rise of China, the rise of India, and all of these sort of technical issues in the economy.
With that in perspective, do you see the devaluation, which was basically done by China, do you think it was timed to go at a time when they could quickly recover the face?
Yeah, probably. I mean, and it was minor. It was a 3% devaluation, right? It was a minor devaluation in advance of the IMF decision on including the yuan or renminbi in the SDR bucket. And I think that in even a week, the devaluation is going to be seen as a very minor thing. And we're going to be moving on to political military issues, as you point out, that are really the shaping issues here.
And climate change. There's a major conference in December that China and the United States have major impacts on the rest of these countries in terms of what agreements may be put in place.
That's right, but those are negotiations with all of the world's countries, and this summit between Xi and Obama is really important. This is the first time that Xi has come to Washington D.C. This is the summit that they have been building up to through all of the earlier summits. This is sort of the summit that says China has arrived.
Okay, we're going to take a break, come right back. All three lines open. It's a fascinating conversation. We'd love to have you be a part of it. That's why it's a talk show, and I'm not just sitting around the kitchen table. 721-1290 is our number, or 1-800-568-5309. You can also make your comments on our Facebook page. We'll be happy to pass them along to our guests. Stay with us. This is Talkback. Hey, we're back on Talkback. Fascinating conversation going on. A lot of it's over my head, but I'm trying to jump up and catch what little bits I can. We're talking about world economy, specifically what's going on in China, how it's going to affect us, especially right here in River City. So, Bob, what do you got?
I've got $1.
Wow.
Mr. Washington, I was reading an article.
Lunch is on you, pal.
That said for every dollar invested, there was a return on that dollar of $1.50 or $2. Now, for every dollar invested, we're getting a return of, 30 or 40 cents on that dollar. So does debt come into play with affecting what kind of productivity we have in the country or what type of innovation? So I'll just let you kind of, open this up for conversation. Is that a hindrance to growth and innovation, or does it sometimes serve a very specific purpose towards those ends?
We were just talking in the break about the notion of debt. We can't really think about debt as just one entity and all debt good, all debt bad, or all debt good, etc. We have to sort of unpack the notion of debt. Who holds it? What are the relationships with the major institutions in the economy? What they expect, and so on and so forth. So, for example, one big distinction we tried to make in the during the break, which your listeners were not privy to, was that it matters whether debt is held internationally or domestically. So so most of U.S. debt is held within the country. So how does that matter? Well, it matters in many ways, where I think Bob was pointing out with the example of the European Union. If, for example, your top bankers and executives have certain informal relationships with politicians, etc., there is more trust in those networks. So, I mean, the people who hold the debt, then they don't panic too quickly because they know that things are under control, more or less. This is sort of the political angle, because we are a political science department, that many people don't really pay attention to, though they know this.
Let me throw in the viewpoint of maybe the small business department for a second here. Because if you're running a business, and I have many friends that have done it, I've had one of my own in the past, one of the things you think about if you're going to get debt is what is the investment going to be in? right? And if a government or a private enterprise is taking that debt and buying a giant trampoline or a water slide with it, that's a little bit different than if it's buying something that will eventually make them more money in the future, right? If they're investing in, let's say, infrastructure or something that we're just going to use as a placeholder for something that will make you more money in the future. And it seems to me that a lot of people have doubts that China has been using its debt wisely, that they've been using it to build, as we mentioned earlier, these ghost cities or ghost malls. They've been using it to ramp up what they can do to try to make everyone not so mad at them for the skies that look like Missoula's. There's a lot of things going on there that people are concerned about. And I just wanted to throw that back in there as one of the major features of debt. If you think of it from the ground, what is the debt actually being used for, rather than just who holds it?
There is very little objectively we can say, I use the word in a philosophical sense, about the future, in the sense that you might, everybody in this, in an economy could be completely deluded, and that might result in very productive debt. So I'll give you an example from America's history. During the Louisiana Purchase, a lot of people said that this is completely unproductive, this is stupid. Why do you want to purchase that big a size of land? Now, Gallatin, who was the Treasury Secretary, he thought knew better, and he was proved right. That debt, when it was traded in the market, it reached 5 or 6 times its value. Basically because investors expected something to come out of those lands. There was nothing there, but they had a time horizon where their expectations converged in such a way that the values increased. So, but at that point, someone could have made a very good argument that this is a stupid investment. It's not going to yield anything. See, this is what's happening in China too. The government is betting on the fact that if they build these things, people will come. And they may be wrong.
There's a movie in there somewhere.
Yeah.
If you build it, he will come.
Yeah, they may be wrong, right? They could be wrong, and then you would be be right.
Here, Karen.
Yeah, and I want to say they're not just betting on one thing, right? So a lot of this debt that's been built up in China has been related to infrastructure, but it's related to productive infrastructure like roads and trains, and both in China and increasingly out of China with the Asian Infrastructure Bank and the Import-Export Bank and so forth that China has. So China's sort of playing the role in Asia and in its own economy and increasingly in the world that the U.S. government played during the New Deal, investing in American infrastructure to try to get the economy out of a depression. If China were not taking on that level of debt, if China had not been taking on that level of debt since the 2008 housing crisis, we would be in a much, much deeper world recession. So it is important to recognize that debt, is not always the full solution, but without the level of debt that the U.S. and China have taken on after 2008, the world economy would really be in the pits. Now, what China needs to do next, and what it knows it needs to do next, is move over to a service economy and a more consumption-based economy. Instead of spurring growth through government spending, it needs to, the result of that needs to be that Chinese consumers begin to save money to buy things and then stoke up the domestic economy.
So
and that is why
they need to start trusting their populace.
That's right. That's right. So that's why this stock market crash is kind of tragic. Instead of getting the Chinese consumers to trust the government markets more, this is going to cause them, for at least some period of time, to have less faith in the government.
But Karen, we're going to have to go to a break, but when we come back, some of what's happening that I've observed is part of kind of the dog's breakfast. It is not a straight line in terms of getting from point A to point B. Sure. And to get through this, there's going to be some dislocation. Right. And when we come back, I want to talk about that in terms of what can be done to minimize that, if it's even at all possible, when you go through these very expansionary type of scenarios.
Okay, we'll come right back and talk about that. But just as a quick update, the shooting at the television station in Virginia, it seems that the gunman is described as a disgruntled television station employee who was being chased by police on a nearby highway. So that's what we have so far, and we'll try to get more details on that at the top of the hour with Fox News. Our News Talk time is 9:20. This is Talk Back. We'll continue in a moment. I can pretty much guarantee by the time we're done at 10 o'clock, we'll have the financial problems of the world nailed. It'll be solved 100%. I'm just kidding. We're having a great conversation this morning with members from the political science department at the University of Montana. Bob Seidenschwartz also joining us from the Montana World Affairs Council. We're in the middle of talking about what's going on in China, and one of the questions I asked, and I guess I might ask Abhisheck as well, what can we learn in this country from what they're doing in China? Can we draw any lessons and say, okay, here's where they make a good decision, here's where they made a bad decision. How can we learn from that?
Well, they have actually learned a lot from the development of the West. And I think I mentioned it last time I was on, that their whole strategy is to speed up this process. And it's natural. They know from history what has worked in the past, the mobilization of huge amounts of manpower, resources, and so on, and building projects. And that is one of the reasons I mentioned, I think last time I remember, they're trying to telescope a process that happened in the West over 200 years into like short 50, 60 years. And it has been done before successfully in the case of Soviet Union at great cost to people in terms of lives. You know, you think of Stalin's collectivization projects, which killed off a lot of people, created a veritable genocide. But China is not that. It's not that problematic, at least since the 1970s. But they're definitely trying to speed up the process.
Well, what I'm asking is, what can we learn from what just happened in China? I mean,
it's hard for, I mean, to learn a lesson from a situation. I mean, it depends on what kind of, in what area do you want to learn a lesson in.
Or we have had not enough time to examine what happened to draw any lessons from it. I don't know,
Peter, one of the things is, I think, and I'd like Karen and Abhisheck to comment on this, is that political systems and culture, at least from my perspective, do matter. So when you raise the question, what do we learn, I could sit down and look at this and say, okay, here's what's happened. What did I learn? But how do I then integrate and apply that into a country like the United States? Ms. Adams?
Well, I would say I think one thing we should learn from what happened this week is that the U.S. recovery is not enough to keep the world economy going. And that is really new. This thing that folks have been worried about for some time now, ever since the Soviet Union fell apart, about when will other parts of the world decouple or become independent enough of the U.S. to be able to affect the U.S., is starting to happen. The U.S. now, just yesterday, announced much higher growth rate, over 3% than what was expected. But that is not going to be enough to turn the economy around. China's downturn is very, very important, and that's an important lesson for the United States. We need to take China seriously as a partner, and we need to do what we can to stoke growth in our own economy and to try to work with China worldwide to keep the economy back on track.
Well, one of the problems is that, you know, since we're in the election season with the presidential elections and so on, now in many ways the job situation in the United States and so on, it feels like it's a zero-sum situation. That, you know, Chinese growth sometimes happens at the expense of job loss in the United States. Now, there are, you know, economists will tell you that in the long run, everybody benefits and so on. But, you know, as Keynes pointed out, in the long run, we are all dead.
He was a brilliant man.
Yeah.
And guess what? He's dead, too.
Yeah. And so, you know, this is not going to be easy to have China as, this is to react to what Karen just said about China being a serious partner. The partnership is going to come with a lot of tensions. So, for example, you know, in the Democratic primary, at least, it's already an issue to bring jobs back to the United States. And these jobs actually originally started disappearing in the 80s, Rust Belt and so on and so forth. Now, bringing them back is going to create a lot of tensions with China. So these are some of the things that we might
check. What kind of jobs are we talking about? Because China's going through its own process of where they were 10 or 15 years ago in terms of what they were manufacturing. Now that's actually going to Vietnam.
Yeah.
It's going to other countries in Southeast Asia which have lower labor costs for particular types
Gosh,
of products.
that just sounds so familiar, you know? So, go ahead.
Well, I need to. I haven't looked at the figures of how big a shift it is in the Chinese labor market from lower end production to sort of higher value added goods and so on, like laptops and so on. But I think at least some of the campaign rhetoric I've been hearing, they've been talking about bringing back manufacturing jobs. The mantra is that manufacturing matters a great deal to spur job growth. That's the biggest engine. So the idea is to bring back manufacturing jobs in the United States. That would involve actually at the stage the U.S. economy is in, directly competing with China labor-wise, which is not possible at in current prices. So it's going to be interesting to see whether the candidates sort of follow up on this or what they do.
Well, and Abhisheck, this is where it goes to. We kind of focus on one area, but who's shipping jobs to the United States in terms of manufacturing? As an example, Germany. So when you compare labor costs to China,
Germany
Mercedes, my friend, is building all sorts of very high-end cars in the United States, in South Carolina, Tennessee. And why? Because part of it is labor costs in Germany are higher than labor costs in the United States.
Are they union jobs or non-union jobs?
Non-union jobs.
Okay, all right.
Specifically, the states that are non-union.
Non-union,
yeah. All right.
But the point is, we're still seeing different countries based on where they are in their economic cycle and what they produce. In some cases, there's advantages here in the U.S. for certain types of work.
Yeah, but the scale matters, right? So when you were talking about bringing back jobs to the United States, people say, well, the real rate of unemployment has to decline by another half or something like that. And so the scale matters a great deal. Now, Germany might move 3,500 jobs to sort of Alabama or something. But, I mean, that's sort of a drop in the bucket in terms of, or the river or the ocean, depending on your preferred metaphor.
Sure.
So my point is that it has to be a large-scale movement. I don't think it's actually, it's highly unlikely that something like that will happen.
In this case, it is not wise to live in the past because we look in the rearview mirror and we have this hazy idea of how wonderful things were when we had all these jobs, and now they're gone. And is it right to say it's not coming back? We have to look forward.
Well, it depends on who you are and what do you think the possibilities are.
And our pasts are very different, Peter.
Yeah.
We weren't around when America was founded, so we have different perspectives.
Yeah, and even
You'll notice that I'm not throwing anything at him right now.
No.
That comes after you guys leave.
No, that's why the coffee is here.
Actually, hold on to that answer, because this aged and decrepit ambassador here is going to take a quick break. If I could just find that button. No, we're going to come right back with more Talk Back. And Dave, I promise we'll get you on right after the break. If I can find the phone, we'll be right back. Thanks for joining us on Talk Back. Go, Karen, go. What was that dance, John?
It's unspeakable.
I don't recognize
I
that.
didn't realize that you and I had the same taste in music.
It's like beholding Cthulhu.
But
You
remember, I'm much older than her. So let's get Dave on the line. Dave, thank you for holding. You're on with our guests. Go ahead.
Yes, as I understand it, labor costs and currency valuations when it comes to world markets are connected. That if currencies drop in value in an individual country, the labor costs or the labor costs for the world, I mean, for that country is better competitive. Now, could you speak to that?
Go ahead, Karen.
Yes.
And thank you for calling.
That's a short answer.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So it's when the value of the currency falls, it's like the economy's on sale, right? So everything from that country to other countries is cheaper. So it's very good for exporters, and it's good for businesses from abroad who wish to put their factories there. But it is not good for investors. And this is why China has a really big problem this week and over the last year of people trying to get their money out ASAP. So China has to balance reducing the value of its currencies enough to stoke manufacturing with reducing it so much that people are pulling their money out of there.
And when you're talking about pulling the money out, are you talking about specifically the markets or just the
Both.
China? Right.
Both.
And China has been attempting to, in effect, manipulate the markets by implementing certain types of policies which have not worked.
Well, let
at
me
the
just
current
say,
time.
every government does that. That's
Well,
why
yeah,
today's
but-
session is called Politics of the World Economy.
Well, and
Yes.
my
So
point
every
that I'm
government
coming
does
to
that.
is, while they attempt to do that, should they be doing that? And really, is this not kind of the learning process of people getting their feet wet, getting burned, and the maturation?
Well, there's no way not to do that. If you have a currency, you are going to have decisions about how much do you favor certain industries, favor foreign investors, favor domestic investors. All of those decisions are made one way or the other. Some of them are more blatant than others. Some countries print money and do it very blatantly. Other countries invest in things and show that they have a preference for certain kinds of industries, and then that benefits less directly, but still benefits them. So, but back to the question about this money leaving China, it's Chinese people taking their money out. That's why there was this big thing a couple weeks ago about Obama has revealed that there are Chinese government agents in the U.S. trying to locate Chinese people who have come to the U.S. and brought their money here. And it's also international businesses and, frankly, people with 401ks also taking their money out of the Chinese and other markets.
To Bob's point, it seems to me the answer that every government does this doesn't fully satisfy people that were asking the question, because every government does it to a different degree of scale, right? And there's a different significance of impact. Yeah?
Well, yeah, there's a huge amount of difference in how governments intervene in well, even talking about intervention in the market is problematic, because the market as a concept itself cannot exist without a pre-existing institutional structure called the government. But almost by definition, there is no such thing as sort of the perfectly free market or something like that. Right. So in that sense, Karen is absolutely right. I mean, to a certain extent, a lot of decisions that are made are political in a broader sense. I mean, when I say politics, I don't mean electoral politics. Political as in, someone gets to decide how things are going to be distributed, produced, consumed, et cetera, et cetera. But you're right, the way historically governments have done this in different contexts is different. So the United States, initially the stock markets, for example, in the United States developed in a context where world trade was not in what it is today. It was somewhat more isolated. Of course, there were foreign investors in the U.S. stock market, even in the 1830s, 1840s. In fact, there was a time in the 1840s, there was a huge default made by private railroad companies, etc., where Americans complained that they couldn't show their faces around London anymore, because at the moment they were identified as Americans, people wanted to kick their butts. So the contexts are different. So what has happened historically is that the evolution of the markets, the stock markets I'm talking about in the United States, have been very different from, say, in China. That reflects how the government acts within the market too. In the United States, because of I'm saying quote unquote tradition of a certain way of running the market, we are used to certain things like more transparency and so on. In China, as Bob pointed out, the stock market is recent. It's very new. They had to create it from scratch. So it looks to us as very heavy-handed. It's just because they haven't had the historical legacy.
Takes time for this.
Yeah,
They haven't learned the art of nuance yet.
And
Yeah,
Peter,
or things like that.
I know we need to take a break. When we come back, I'd like to talk about the emerging
Thanks for the call,
markets
Dave.
a bit, because we're talking about China, but as goes China, we're seeing some real currency devaluations and economic loss in some of the emerging economies. So when we come back, I'd like to ask you two to address that a little bit.
Stay with us. And by the way, we have all three lines open. Be like Dave. Be like some of our other callers. 721-1290. You have a question or a comment? Because believe it or not, folks, what you've got in your 401k is directly tied to what we're talking about today. So this is not just their money, it's your money we're talking about. We'll be right back. And we're back on Talkback. 721-1290 is our number. Right in the middle of discussing, I was talking with the Abhisheck while you guys were out trying to find coffee that doesn't exist right now, by the way.
Yeah, I want to talk to the general manager about this, please.
I just feel like we're in that play, no coffee, no coffee, no coffee. How to succeed in business without really trying. Anybody see that? Anyway, but that's an old play, right, John? Anyway, I was talking with Abhisheck about the fact that there is no such thing as good economic news or bad economic news, right? I mean, when you looked at what happened in China, it was really bad for some people, but not a bad thing for other people. Is that right, Bob?
Hey, one man's long is another man's short.
Yeah.
You know, it just depends on what side of the trade you're on. But look, this is the dynamic of the world that we exist in, and trying to make some sense of it is what we're here today. So one of the questions I asked before the break is, we're talking about China, the U.S., but there's another world out there called the emerging economies. Those are the Mexicos and, the Philippines and countries in the Southeast Asia. So they're getting hammered right now. Their markets are getting hammered. Their currencies are getting hammered. Money is fleeing out of those economies. So, if you could talk a little bit about that in terms of, how this impacts us possibly even here.
Go, Karen, go.
Go, Karen.
Well, so one of the things that the Chinese Foreign Ministry is most proud of, that they talk about most often this year, is that China has become the largest trading partner of more than 130 countries in the world. And of course, in those 130 countries are the so-called BRICS: Brazil, Russia, India, China, of course, is one of the BRICS, South Africa, and then the larger countries beneath that are in the G20. And so it's not surprising that we're seeing all of this come together at the same time. In fact, the reason that the emerging markets like Brazil started to fall before the big Chinese crash is that over the last year, as the Chinese economy has slowed, China has stopped buying as many commodities, and this has, created some weakness in the emerging markets.
So, Karen, in general, and Abhisheck, emerging economies, would you say, are very heavily dependent on exporting various commodities to the more developed countries?
That would be true for China. I think China wants to, whether they acknowledge it or not, create that kind of an exchange where, and this is sort of natural, that with Indonesia or Brazil, et cetera, they'll import commodities and export finished goods and so on. Now, recently, over the last 5 or 6 years, the new development is that Chinese manufactured, say, phone makers, etc. They're trying to move in a big way into India, the Indian market, because it's still untapped in the parlance of the day, and so basically they have made a big, very conscious push to design products to suit the Indian market. And there was a very interesting article I read a few months ago about this. So they realized that they cannot, going back to what Karen was saying, that they can't just rely on the United States or particular European Union countries for this. And the Chinese are actually, in a way, trying to consciously focus on other big emerging economies like Brazil and India, and as consumers of their manufactured products.
We do have a call. By the way, our guests, in case you just joined us, Abhisheck Chatterjee, Karen Adams, also joining us, and if you want to grab those headphones, Karen, let's get Kate. Of course, Bob Seiden-Schwartz is over there, but he's tall. I barely see him over the top of the monitor there. Okay, Katie, you're on Talkback. Please go ahead, ma'am.
Good morning. I'm very interested in this dismal subject of economics. Between 1800 and 1900, the purchasing power of the American dollar doubled. Now, this is significant when you think about how many wars we were entangled in. A civil war, and Abraham Lincoln was asked what he was going to do about the currency. He said, "We'll print our currency as the trust of the American people in America." And he didn't live to go to bed that night. Russia and the United States were the only two countries who were totally independent of the internationalist banking system of the House of Rothschild. And since 1900, we have never had a year or any period of time since our American dollar has doubled in value. That should be significant, because we're getting an awful lot of verbiage about economics, but it's really very simple. Either you own something of wealth or you don't. And the pretense of the International Monetary Fund and the IMF and the previous shell games on the American people only did things such as indebt little nations with a lot of natural resources.
Now, Katie, please forgive me, but do you have a question for our guests that they could answer?
Say that again, please.
Would you have a question for our guests that they might be able to answer?
I would like to know how many of these little nations went into bankruptcy and lost their natural resources, and their peasants were dispossessed of their property, their homes, their land, in order to feed their own little children and their families.
Okay.
I'd like to know of the damage that these international IMF has done to destroy countries in Africa, to turn them into slave labor camps and starvation for little black children and little white children.
Okay.
I'd like to know that damage, because this is all tied up with economics and what is being done with the theft system of economics that we have.
Thank you for your call. So our guests, we're talking about the international banking conspiracy here, or the conglomerate or whatever. So we have a bunch of folks here who are pretty good at this stuff. So go ahead, John. What do you think?
Well, I think the best question to ask, and one that I think is assumed in the question lineup here, is a single group of individuals causing some of the horrors that we see around the world? Or is it a disparate impact of human will from various points of direction? And a lot of people look at the world and they see a collapse here, and they see the economy being involved. They see a collapse in a small island nation, the economy being involved, and they say, hey, it looks like these big dogs that are running the banking system are doing all of this damage. So is it as easy as that, or is it more complicated?
We'll take a quick break, come right back, and talk more about that. We're up against our last break of the day. It's 1 minute, 721-1290. We'll be right back. Hey, we're rapidly running out of time. We're talking about politics and the world economy, and Abhisheck Chatterjee joining us from the Political Science Department, along with Karen Adams and Bob Seidenschwartz from the Montana World Affairs Council, John King, and what was my name again? I don't know. Okay, so now Katie just asked a rather direct question about is there a conspiracy, international banking conspiracy that's basically robbing small countries of their natural resources and turning these countries into slaves?
I mean, there were two, as John pointed out. You have to separate like two parts of this question. One is the one you said: is there a concerted conspiracy? And the number two is the second point about disparate impact. That's also an interesting question. I'll start with the second part. There is certainly some validity to the fact that to the argument that when IMF policies, when smaller countries went into debt as a result of balance of payments problems in the 80s, etc., and when they had to then borrow money from the IMF did put in place very strict policies about what the government could or couldn't do, or what they could or couldn't spend on. And if you go by what Joseph Stiglitz says when he was in the World Bank, they had a really terrible impact on poorer countries in Africa and Central America sometimes, where the government was prevented from spending on roads and schools and so on. They had to,
in other words, pay off our debt first.
Yep, exactly.
Right.
And it's the Greek negotiation was also about that. So yeah, there's a lot of validity to that IMF programs disproportionately harm poorer people. Now, is that a conspiracy? I'm not so convinced. I think that over time there has emerged an orthodoxy in international finance or international economics where people think that these are the policies, like strict austerity and so on and so forth, in the long run are good. Now, you and I might disagree, but the people enforcing those policies, I think a lot of times do it because they believe that in the long run it'll lead to better outcomes. On the other hand,
is the IMF just a giant payday loan group? You know
well,
what I mean?
the IMF has been accused of being, enforcers for big banks. That they have been, but not that's sort of as used as a metaphor.
One of the other things she said was, it's very simple. You either have something of value or you don't. I wanted to get your take on that summation.
Well, that's believe it or not, that's a very deep question that has not yet been resolved in the literature and economics. What is value? Right. You have to talk about value theory and so on, and I don't think we can resolve it. I mean, what economists work with is a subjective theory of value.
Right. We were just talking the other day about how Legos were a better investment than the stock market over the past 10 years. How are you going? Yes, it's true.
It's true. I hate
And
to say.
how does someone know that? How does someone know that other people are going to put value in a plastic toy that is awesome? It's really hard to know, right? And so why other people value things, it's difficult. It's more of a human psychology than it is a science, or it's a softer science for sure.
Or the other way of looking at it is that at this stage of humanity, we don't know very little about how we work as a species, and maybe we will never know when we destroy ourselves in the next 200 years or something. That was true.
I was just going to say,
How optimistic there.
we're now on the philosophy of the world economy.
Gotcha. Okay. We have about 3 minutes left of the program, Bob. So as we're wrapping up here, I guess I want to give Karen and Abhisheck both a minute each to just kind of wrap up of some of the things we talked about. Abhisheck, you first. You go ahead.
Well, we covered a lot of ground, as we tend to always do
cool.
here.
Yes, we did.
I really like it. I would like to do this over some beers sometime.
Okay.
I'll be free on the weekend.
Okay. The point is that, I would just want to emphasize the point that you implicitly made a few minutes ago, that the world economy, we might think in Missoula, we are sort of very far from it, etc., but it affects us in many real ways. And I think I would urge our listeners to pay a little more attention to international news. Sometimes I know the eyes glaze over when people use jargon, but trust me, the concepts behind those jargon are very they're very accessible. You just have to Google them, look them up or something. And it's hard work at first, but then once you get used to the vocabulary, you'll become a lay analyst. So
I just want to say thank you to our guests, but I want to take just a minute or so because, Bob, you gave me this very important piece of paper here for the Montana World Affairs Council. Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, a gentleman who we have had on our Talkback program on the Montana World Affairs Council not long ago. He's going to be here in Missoula, a Missoula community discussion with Imam Faisal Abdul Rauf, named one of Time Magazine's most influential people in the world in the year 2011. He has devoted his career to healing relations between Muslim Americans and their neighbors while bringing the message of peace to the wider Muslim world. He's going to be here in Missoula October 20th through the 22nd. Is that right, Bob?
That's correct.
Okay.
Right.
So, and now when and where? Are there going to be others?
Yes, we will have flyers, lots of pre-advertising out about this, since this is going to be a very important event for us here in Missoula to have a man of this status come to us to be able to have these discussions. We'll have a public lecture. He will be here on the radio doing live interactive with students on Council in the Classroom, as well as appearing at the high schools to talk to the students. So to your point, that's why the council exists. So Please, Karen, wrap it up for us.
All right. Well, I would say it's been an interesting month, and stay tuned for a very interesting 18 months as we move into the China-U.S. summit, the big anniversary of the UN, and most importantly, China's leadership of the G20 over next year.
And will Donald Trump totally destroy relations with the rest of the world?
I know
Stay
when
tuned.
to keep my chits close at hand. That is not a forecast I am making, Peter. What's your forecast on that?
It's too soon to know.
Oh, good answer.
I'm really enjoying Trump, though. Yeah. I mean, it would be a shame if he ever dropped out of the...
He's certainly a lot of fun, and he does make for good copy. So anyway, we're out of time for tomorrow, John. What's up?
Tomorrow,
I have no idea.
We will. I don't know. I can't see it from here.
Well, we'll have a show tomorrow. Bye, everybody.